Thanks, Bob. Thanks for the intro. Morning, good afternoon, and evening, everybody, because I know we've got global viewers. It's a pleasure to be here. And today I want to maybe extend a little bit on what Jesse's just shared and bring to life what a CBDC innovation looks like when working with the likes of central banks, commercial banks, and regulators. So I'm going to keep it pretty simple and talk about the new ways of working, right? So it's no surprise that we're talking about CBDCs, and I'm not going to repeat some of the things Jesse said. However, we also need to talk about how we innovate, not necessarily how we're going to get to central bank digital currencies, but how we're actually going to innovate. What's the new ways of working? Because when was the last time, I don't know anyone who rolled out a currency, right? So if we're all in this kind of new form, trying to roll out digital currency. So we have to think about how we work. And what do I mean by that is when we're rolling out a change, and especially when the change is so big, we have to go back to the first principles. We have to go back to the mindset. And, Jesse touched on mindsets, and some of the other panelists are also going to touch on use cases. But if you think about any big impact, any big change that's going to be rolled out, you can boil that down to three basic things, which, basic but complex, is the people. And who are the people that are involved, the stakeholders, when we're considering central bank digital currencies? What are some of the processes, the policy, the framework, and the governance around it? Not only the governance to roll it out, but also the governance to maintain. And what about the technology, which is not just a single rabbit hole, but multiple rabbit holes? So let me just share. So what I'm going to do with you today is I'm going to share with you how we worked with a number of central banks, regulators, and commercial banks, and working with, and what are some of the lessons we learned, and what are some of the things we're seeing. So just quickly to set the context. So as Bob mentioned, NayaOne does two things. We're a digital sandbox company, and as well as fintech as a service. From a digital sandbox perspective, how we work with the CBDC is to establish a marketplace for particular clients and bringing number of tech that is required. And by number of tech, I don't just mean the core ledger, but also what are some of the wallets, what are some of the API stacks, etc., that are required in order to make the whole ecosystem work. Then from a data perspective, including data sets, not just transaction data sets, but what is a profile of different SMEs that look like they're going to be working in this. Then we have multiple sandboxes. And the reason I say multiple sandboxes here is when I go through some of the use cases, we were able to spin out a sandbox per use case and allocate a working group or a governance unit that would take that forward. And then lastly, we have the orchestration layer that brings all these things together in order to allow a working group that's focused on financial inclusion to take that forward. Now, I'll give you the key point. The key point here is you're able to bring all the stakeholders and all the tools into one place to digitally, to start innovating digitally. In a secure place without the real data, right? That's the key point of doing this. So if we start with some of the design principles of the work we were doing, for this particular case, it was stability, coexistence, and efficiency. And if you think about some of the things that you'll hear today and throughout the conference, they boil down to a good 80-90% boil down to these three things. If we look at some of the CBDC use cases that we were addressing, it was the inclusion, it was the future of payments, it was digital innovation, and that also touches on some of the interoperability elements. I think a big one was around policy testing. So be able to set up policy frameworks digitally and run through governance frameworks and technologies and data through that in the sandbox to see how the policy and frameworks suitability and be able to adjust them as they go. Interoperability I spoke about, and the programmability from an actual technology perspective. Now, if I look at, just quickly touching on people perspective, I'm looking at people from different types of money, right? So, and that helps us kind of see who are the different stakeholders and they overlap, but this also helped us kind of narrow down or rather expand and not leave any stakeholders off the list. And it also helped us marry them to the use cases that I mentioned earlier. Now, if I look at CBDC's technology, I didn't have a page big enough to put all the vendors on here. But one of the common things we hear from our clients and perspectives is we just don't know who to go with. As Bob mentioned, there's 80 plus central banks that are looking at CBDC. There's just as many, or if not more, commercial banks looking at the impact of CBDCs as well as stablecoins. And there's, the list of vendors is constantly growing. So it's about how do you narrow that down? And I think it comes down to your design principles and your list of stakeholders and your objectives and having a place where you can bring them. Now, from an interoperability perspective, I think the biggest one is CBDC cannot operate in a silo. It has to operate within the economy between different stakeholders, but also cross-border between number of people. And that comes with all sorts of, standardization within the, economy, within the continent, within the, legal frameworks. So I think as an industry, we're only just started scratching the surface on this thing. And then there's plenty more questions to be answered on the interoperability. So that's an area where we spend a lot of time discussing. And one thing that not always gets mentioned is when you're looking at interoperability, it's not just about interoperability from core ledger to commercial bank tech to end user consumer wallets, digital wallets, but it's central bank to central bank. But again, my key point is it's not just that it can interoperate, but can it interoperate effectively and efficiently, and can it handle the performance, right? And then I think that's a very important point. And my friends would say that that's okay, that's the two problem. But anyone who's had the privilege of rolling out complex systems would go, that's a day two problem, but you got to have it on your radar. I see Jesse laughing his head off. So from a data perspective, I know it kind of rolls up within the tech, people process tech in the tech part, but data on its own is pretty important. And within this is the privacy, the access and management, and with most countries having customer digital rights. It's an important element to be factored in here, and the digital ID solutions. And I'll mention the I word, the interoperability between those regulations as well as those technologies is an important piece. Now, architecture, I think we can do a whole session on its own, but I think the important point I want to mention here is this is another within tech. If I break tech down, it's the actual technology, it's the data, it's the architecture blueprint. And the reason I put that here is when you come up with the design principles day one, or what you want to do, they have to go along with the architectural blueprints. And again, you can build these out in day two, but you've got to have them on your radar. Again, just to wrap it and bring it back home, we were able to load up the solution marketplace with all sorts of different technology. So core ledger, the commercial bank tech and different nodes, and also different wallets, and actually run that end to end. Then able to interact with another type of core ledger using different type of data sets, and having a sandbox per use case. And having that visibility both by the central bank and the regulator and having it transparent across the different groups that were participating in this. Now, the last point, and I'm sure I'm up against almost time, is the thing. There were a lot of learnings, and this is still ongoing, and there's new ones spinning up. But the 5 things that I thought that made the most impact when we talk about CBDC innovation is having a common starting point, and that's the, and it kind of touches into the agreed design principles. And, it's one of those things that you can have a conversation about for next 3 months and next 6 months. But I think the important tip I would give is at 80-20, agree the design principles, what matters, and it touches on the motivation of why you're doing it, but not losing the foresight of what will come, because otherwise it will be a half a solution and it's really hard to backtrack. The third important tip is considering interoperability from day one. Fourth point is ability to test policy. No one's going to have the right policy or the framework from day one. Even if we think we are, as these things start to go live, there will be changes. You're better off testing the policy in the sandbox with the stakeholders against the technologies and the data sets, and having those things resolved rather go live and have those issues later. And testing for the technology constraints. So the important point there is don't just test the technology, but test it for the constraints, what's possible and what's not possible. And I think that's main. So thank you for your time. I hope that was of value.